Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Is there a paranormal factor in psychotherapy? What do you do when things in the room start moving during a session with a patient? What is projective identification?
Hello, and welcome to the 826th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I am Ben, and those moving questions came from my co-host, partner in paranormal adventures, and dad, Paul. Today we welcome a distinguished guest on a new subject, and we welcome your calls. The number to call is 401-766-1240. That is from anywhere, or you can email Paul at behindtheparanormal.com or contact us via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
Dr. Paul J. Dr. Paul J. Leslie is a licensed psychotherapist and educator with a great interest in the history and folklore of the South Carolina Lowcountry. The author of 6 books that I know of, he has extensive 7 now. He has extensive experience in creative approaches to working with clients and presents workshops to other mental health professionals nationally and internationally. His books include Lowcountry Shamanism, an exploration of the magical and healing practices of the coastal Carolinas and Georgia. His latest book, the subject of our show today, is Shadows in the Session, the Presence of the Anomalous in Psychotherapy. His website, drpaulleslie.com.
So, Dr. Paul Leslie, welcome to Behind the Paranormal, or welcome back, I should say.
Yeah, well, thanks, guys. It's always a pleasure to be with you both.
Oh, well, it's great to have you back. So, in the book, you give us a sort of a history on this subject from the viewpoint of the people like Carl Jung and Melanie Klein. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this the whole premise of the book is that I was finding a lot of hidden stories and experiences that some psychotherapists were having while they were in session with certain clients. It's not something that happens all the time, and I'll even say it rarely happens. But these experiences, which I label as anomalous experiences, but some people may call paranormal, would be quite frightening, striking, disarming, confusing. And there's a kind of bit of a conspiracy of silence about these things. So I thought it might be a good idea to look back throughout the history of psychotherapy. And what I found was that even from the early beginnings of our field, this is a topic, the anomalous is a topic we've grappled with. We don't know what to do with it. When it shows up, a lot of times as a field, we find it's best to ignore it, dismiss it, demonize it, whatever it is, so that it's not being explored as I think it could be. I don't know why this is. Maybe it is because we all want to protect our professional standing, or maybe it's just something that's an uncomfortable subject to explore. But it really set me on a path to figure out, not just why this is happening, but so much as, how do people deal with these things when they do occur?
Well, one of the things that struck me too, and you mentioned this in the book as well, is in the history, is that when the science of psychology was growing in the 19th century, and of course psychotherapy coming from that, also what was growing was spiritualism and what was generally referred to as psychical research, and there are some interesting parallels there. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What's really interesting for me is when we go back and we really delve into the early history of the field of psychology, and a lot of people technically put the date of the founding of psychology in 1879 when Wilhelm Wundt, who in Germany opened the first laboratory to study psychology. So it's a fairly new discipline. Although there is quite a bit of debate because it turns out William James, who's we consider him the father of American psychology, was teaching psychology and I think had a lab at Harvard in 1876. So the question is, why does Wundt get the father of psychology label and our American hero William James didn't. Well, a lot of it is because William James, in addition to the many other brilliant things he did, he had an active interest in studying from a psychological perspective what we refer to as psychical research. And psychical research started as a way to test and examine a lot of claims that were coming out of the spiritualist movement. If people aren't familiar with that, kind of started in the mid-1800s with the Fox sisters, who were these two young girls in upstate New York who were having what they claimed spirit interactions with the deceased resident of the home they lived in, and that created a kind of a nationwide interest in mediumship and things of that nature. So it would only stand to reason that in time some people in the new field of psychology would say, well, if something's happening and it involves the human mind, maybe we need to test it and explore it. But the problem was that just by giving it any attention, some people got a lot, much like today, got a lot of grief, got a lot of character assassination, minimized in their own field. And I think that's what some of the things that happened to William James. So what's also interesting to me is I found that in the first two international congresses on psychology, half of the presentations on those first two involved psychical research. So we had very educated people, not just from the field of psychology, but all kinds of scientific endeavors who were actively exploring this. And it just seemed after about the third Congress of Psychology, there was a intentional phasing out of that topic. This to me, this is unfortunate, because I think that by at least opening our mind to studying something, we don't have to agree on the etiology, where it comes from or what it is, but at least to study that something's there. So there has been this history, much like today, a back and forth between the more materialistic view of science and then those who view other realms, if we should call it that.
It's really interesting that you kind of mentioned that in your book, in the first chapter, sort of discussing the unknown. You kind of bring it into the present and talk about, well, I guess technically it's not the present because it was 2019, but right. in the previous year, that it seems as if there's a growing interest in sort of psychical phenomena versus going to traditional therapy sessions. And do you find that this sort of trend of sort of balance, not even really a balance, but kind of 1 to 2 extremes, hasn't really changed that much? Because it seems as if there is, it's interesting that there's sort of like a light stigma that's perpetrated by society that going to see a therapist or whatever, but for some reason there's really not much stigma sort of hanging around that of going to see a psychic or whatever. Now, would you be able to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be stigma about therapy, and I think there will always be some scoffers and stigma of going to see a psychic. But the research is showing that more and more people are turning to psychics and mediums for help with problems that they may have traditionally sought psychotherapy for. Our field of psychotherapy has, without a doubt, empirically shown that we can help alleviate emotional suffering. But in spite of that, people feel more drawn sometimes to talk to a psychic or have other explanations for human behavior or situations they find themselves in that's out of the realm of what has become a more scientific look at people's thoughts, behavior, and emotion. So I see incredible parallels, almost a circular repeat of the late 1800s in today, and that there is a battle going on between the more mainline scientific skepticism and the more, I'll just say, post-materialist kind of view of consciousness and those kind of things. And I think anytime that there's a dichotomy set up, I think we eliminate possibilities. So, but I wonder if that's human nature. You're either on side A or side B. And I always wondered, is there a side C to where we can take all of those?
D, E, F, and G. You know?
Exactly. So, but yeah, Ben, I totally agree. I think that this is a repeat, if you will, and unfortunately, the lines been drawn pretty deeply.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's kind of a paradox, right? You'd think that with sort of the strides that have been made, especially in the fields of psychology, that that people are, well, at least psychologists and forgive me if I'm wrong, are at least more open to the idea of the anomalous than in previous decades. Probably because the consciousness research is a thing now, and perhaps as sort of a species we're kind of almost ready to deal with it and almost ready to kind of engage what consciousness really means. Because really, the only thing we can kind of point to is, it's non-local. We know that, and that's pretty much all we know. Mm-hmm. So do you think that this sort of trend is more of like a rebellion of a culture to say, oh well, science is great and all, but it's really all about spirit. It seems as if that sort of Enlightenment period dualism is still very much a thing in our society.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And if I'm going to make a sweeping overgeneralization, is that most people in the field of psychotherapy, and again I'm saying most, not all, have very little working knowledge about the field of consciousness. Unfortunately, too much of psychotherapy has been rooted in very linear explanations for certain things. So way back when, in the psychodynamic Freudian era, it was you're doing and experiencing certain things due to unconscious, repressed, drive, sexuality, whatever. And then when the behaviorists came in, it's like, no, you're doing things because you've just been programmed and conditioned. And then the cognitive therapies come in and say, well, you're doing things because you're thinking this way, and that's causing you to feel this and then to do that. And then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Humanistic, it's, you haven't had enough positive regard and a healthy self-concept. So we're always looking for this linear way to see A to B to C. But I find that most people don't work that way. And I find that therapists who think only in that manner sometimes get stuck when they deal with more complexity. Now, if we talk about consciousness, we're talking about a very complex topic. And looking at this from different theories of complexity, I think a lot of therapists just don't have enough working knowledge or to understand that. And certainly we are taught in graduate school that if someone, one of our clients, starts to talk about strange phenomena or experiences, it is unfortunately a knee-jerk pathological, pathological assertion rather than something that may indeed be grounded in their reality. And so we are instantly supposed to diagnose this as being a negative. So I think there's so many different ways to look at this that it can't be just either this or either that. And I just would like to see more therapists at least having an open mind toward working with these kind of ideas. They don't have to believe it. And believe me, I'm very skeptical. But at the same time, what am I dealing with as a human being in front of me as a client? And that's who I need to be working with, not always my preferred theory or technique.
So that being said, let's talk about some cases. What are some of these experiences that you've had that you can point to this and say, well, hey, at least we're engaging it?
Well, I've only had one experience, and it involved an interaction I had with a long-term client, a lady I liked very much, and we had gotten a lot of work done in the positive. But one day she came in and she was really down. Just give you an abbreviated story. She was missing her father, who had died many years ago, and she felt that her father might have been ashamed of her due to her mental health issues. And so in talking to her, I just asked her the casual question. I said, well, this empty chair beside me, if your father was sitting in this empty chair right now, what do you think he would say? Now, this is a pretty typical technique from something like Gestalt therapy. But in that moment, the weirdest thing, and I have never experienced this, and since, and I'm thankful that I haven't, it felt like someone sat in the chair beside me. And all of a sudden, I started getting these images and things in my head that I didn't know where they were coming from. And out of my mouth came, and I got an image, two images. Image of that type of sherbet ice cream that we get a lot of times as kids called a push-up.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I saw a body of water like a lake. And I heard come out of my mouth to this lady, I said, does a push-up ice cream mean anything to you? And her mouth dropped open, and she says, oh, my God, my dad used to always take me to the lake, and he would buy me push-ups, and I'd pretend to put it on like I was putting on lipstick, and we'd both laugh, and that was our thing. And I just was overcome for some weird reason by all this emotion and just started crying and a little bit of shaking and concerned her. And next thing I know, I'm saying, well, your father loves you very much, and I don't remember much after that. But somehow we got through the rest of the session, and like I said, I've never had that experience again, and I don't want anyone to think that I am a medium or anything. I do not claim that. But it has, if you'll pardon the pun, it has haunted me for a long time. Why did that happen? Am I the only one that this has happened to? What are the explanations for this? Because, where I am in my life now, I'm not ready to believe that a dead person was communicating through me. But that's my belief system now. So I needed to find some other explanations. And that's what sent me on this journey. And so when I opened up the floor metaphorically to my colleagues, when I asked for other stories, it was quiet for a while. People were uncertain about what, if they should even say anything. But privately, I started getting more and more email stories, and I realized I'm not the only one that this is happening to.
Yeah. Can you give some examples, Paula, of things that you've picked up from other professionals during sessions that, things that have happened during sessions?
Sure. The most common I have found is the occurrence of what we'll call telepathy. A lot of people, refer to it as ESP. It's interchangeable, but basically being able to pick up and read someone else's thoughts. And this dates back, though, if we go back to Sigmund Freud. Freud was having an issue with telepathy happening so much in his sessions that he eventually came up with this idea that they weren't going to call it telepathy. He referred to it as thought transference, meaning that the thoughts of the client were being projected onto the therapist and vice versa. Now, transference is a common psychoanalytical term Freud came up with, in which the patient will project his or her unconscious material onto the therapist. So a lot of people think that what Freud was trying to do was trying to come up with some, if you'll excuse the term, pseudo-scientific term to minimize the esoteric or paranormal aspect of what was happening in his office. And throughout a good bit of the literature I've read over the past 100 years, telepathy seems to be more common of all the different anomalous experiences. One in particular is just many therapists would say things like, things just pop into my head. It's kind of like they're talking about a friend of theirs, and for some reason I'll think of Allison. And I find out in a minute later they mention the friend's name is Allison, and I don't know how that happened. Those kind of things are very common. But I don't think that's limited to, obviously, therapy. Couples who are very close and very connected will often have those things happen. So it may be that arises as a result of that unconscious connection or interaction within the therapy room. So I would say the most common would probably be kind of telepathic reports of telepathic occurrences. Other things have been certain sensations that the person has felt. Other people have heard things that giving them information about the client, like in their inner ear that they thought the client heard and the client didn't hear. Others have seen weird, strange things. In one case, I remember there was a client who would repress her emotions. Anytime she'd get upset, she'd swallow her emotions down. Not always a good thing. And then one day, it was such an intense amount of outpouring of emotion, when she tried to push it down, the lamp that was beside the client, the therapist, watched it just move off. Not just tip over, but slide off almost on its own and fall, which...
That's the case I was thinking of, yeah.
Yeah, shook the therapist to the core, and even had the client get up and try to come up with alternative explanations for how a lamp that was heavy, that's never been moved in that way, did. And so she just came to the conclusion, much like Carl Jung did, that there is, when we're under stress, sometimes this... energy, internal energy, if you will, unconscious energy, can affect things, kind of what we call psychokinesis, those kind of things. And some people have attributed some poltergeist activity to that.
Yes, indeed. I've run into that myself a lot. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the question arises, when this occurred, what do your reaction to your experience was very emotional, understandably so. What do your colleagues do with this when it happens? And also, before you even answer, what percentage of the colleagues you've spoken with about this have actually had things of this kind occur?
Well, it's really difficult for me to put a percentage. So, like, if I were to do a percentage of the field, what's the percentage? The reason is because, number one, I didn't use a standardized measurement and send out this mass mailing and for people. But I think the other thing is I feel a lot of, and I have been told by a lot of my colleagues, I've had one in particular who's a very well-known colleague who has had something happen but will refuse to tell. He told me, which I appreciate and I'm honored, but, doesn't want anyone else to know. So there's such a reluctance. I think that the bulk of people who do therapy will never have this happen in a session, but I think it's a small percentage. But when it happens, man, does it happen. And as far as what to do with it, I think that's the dialogue we need to have in our field. When something strange does happen, do we just immediately dismiss it? Do we, think that, look for a rational explanation, which I totally endorse. That should be our first step. But if we can't explain it away, is it something that we discuss with the client? I mean, these are questions that it may be on a case-by-case basis, but it seems to be very unnerving for so many that, and just a reluctance to talk about it. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point anytime soon to having an agreed upon agenda of how to deal with that.
Yeah, who are you going to call?
Yeah.
Well, I've actually had, at least in my experience, 3 groups of people have the most contact with, particularly poltergeist phenomena. Very often the, external dramatic paranormal phenomena in general. Police officers, all right, clergy, who half the time don't know what they're doing, and mental health professionals, okay? And I worked with some of them myself in the 70s. And I've actually had several psychiatric social workers tell me that I'm more skeptical than they are. So it is out there, and it's going on. So
absolutely.
All right. What we're going to go to a question from a listener here. We're going to have a break, though, too, in a minute. But you can sort of think of this over the course of the break, I guess, Paul. This is from our beloved show reporter out in California, in San Francisco, Richard. And Richard asks, he has 2 questions here. One is, I'll give it to Ben, on number 1 there.
Alrighty, so the first question is, With the schizophrenic patient, what do you think about their sensitivity to the paranormal?
Well, why don't we take our break first?
Yeah, so digest that.
Paul can mull that over. Okay. All right, very good. Okay, so you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's paranormally warm, and we'll pay for it over the next 3 months, Blackstone River Valley. Stick with us. We'll be right back with our great guest, Paul Leslie, on the subject of strange things happening during psychotherapy sessions. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Greg Bell, the host of When Radio Was.
I'm Mortimer. Bill. Is that you under that blindfold?
Bill, with this thing on, I can't see who I am.
No, I imagine not. Can't you see anything at all under that blindfold?
On a clear day, I can see the blindfold.
You can?
Yeah.
When Radio Was, shows from the past for today's imaginations.
When Radio Was airs Monday through Friday, right here on ON 1240 Radio at 11 a.m. and 11 p.m.
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
Okay, so we'll go back to that question that Ben asked before the break from our show reporter Richard in San Francisco. What do you think about their sensitivity to the paranormal?
Well, there's multiple ways to answer that. With people who, the question was involving schizophrenics, people who suffer from some aspects and forms of schizophrenia, they would be more susceptible to seeing things and hearing things. But if you're from more of a linear materialistic view, you would say, and the evidence is there, that generally we're seeing disruption in the manufacturing and distribution of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, which involves our muscles, movement. It's a pleasure and reward center, but it also governs perception. So a lot of times they'll say, well, if people are having paranormal experiences, much like some people who have schizophrenia and are have some kind of doorway open to seeing things, hearing things, feeling things that aren't there, that may be disruption in dopamine. Now, if I could kind of counter that just a little bit, recently I read, and it was a journal, a scientific journal from Holland, and I apologize, I can't remember the author's name or the title, but it stated that the general public overall has at least a couple of experiences that they would define as a visionary or hearing auditory, hallucinatory experiences, even if it's just one time. So when I was reading that, I was thinking, well, if the majority of the population in the course of their life has at least one of those, then to me, this idea of paranormal is maybe we need to investigate that term.
Yeah.
Because it may be more of the norm, but because of a societal view of certain things, it gets pushed aside as into something that is abnormal. Now, in the realm of some people with severe schizophrenia, it is abnormal, and I don't mean that as a personal judgment on their worth, but just statistically. And they need help. They need to find the best treatment available, but at the same time, a lot of people say, well, something about the brain has changed to where maybe that brain is more of a filter. And the schizophrenic, in some people, the schizophrenic state may be a way that the filter kind of decreases a little bit and lets in information that they see and hear things that's out there that the rest of us wouldn't. But that's one of the bigger debates. Is it just purely issues in the brain or the brain a filter? And when you have these kind of situations, medical issues happen, it kind of pierces the veil a little bit.
Okay. And we have a second question from Richard. Ben, if you would...
If I would be so kind.
Yes.
Any thoughts on how frequency, particularly lower frequencies, affect mental health? Should psychiatric patients avoid being near lower frequency areas?
I don't feel I'm qualified to comment on that because I just don't have enough evidence. It is intriguing, though, because obviously frequency does have an impact on our bodies, sound frequencies, and just I remember reading in my research to where a group of psychologists and geologist, I think it was, went to a certain haunted locations in England, and then they measured certain frequency of the Earth. There's with all the technology they have, and they found that there were subtle changes in certain areas that would proclaimed haunted. Now that may be, they use that and say, okay, well, since there's changes, that's affecting our nervous system, and so that's why we're feeling a certain way or experiencing certain things. Again, to equal time, the counter to that is, well, what if there are strange, weird things there that have those frequencies? And that's why you're doing that. So if indeed there is something to this kind of idea of how the Earth magnetic and all that, it might be something to look into, but I don't feel I'm qualified to make that kind of statement either way.
Okay. Well, it's actually a really great segue into a question I wanted to bring up, because you bring up the work of Mesmer and magnetic forces in the book, and it's really fascinating because very recently there have been some studies coming out about how because Mesmer basically has said that there is possibly a fluid in human bodies that sort of generates electromagnetic fields, kind of like animal magnetism, because animals have a magnetic field around them, and he sort of, he did work with magnets that would help with psychiatric treatment, and it was really, really interesting because recent studies have shown that we as humans do actually respond to the magnetic fields of the Earth. But I mean, it's studies, so we don't really know for sure, but it's interesting how that kind of comes up. Now, with this sort of magnetic fields, let's just sort of do some hyperbole here and say that's true. I was thinking about the sort of thought transference sort of idea that we brought up earlier in the show. Now, therapy is a very, very personal activity. There's a lot of sharing, a lot of going back and forth, and in normal conversation, you wouldn't go up to somebody and spill your deepest, darkest secrets. But in a therapy session, there's a lot of trust, there's a lot of openness, and there's a lot of connection. Now, this is sort of a melding of the two ideas. Have you done any sort of research or found that perhaps thought transference and these magnetic fields or animal magnetism would be related in some way, shape, or form?
Well, what I was investigating, the whole idea of environment of the therapy room. Now, there can be the physical environmental aspects, as possibility of frequencies and those kind of things. With a physical environment, I would think, though, that would be happening more often for therapists. So what I'm wondering is kind of what you're asking is there a certain thing that happens when two individuals come together to create a certain interpersonal environment? Now, we know that our brain has a type of neuron we call mirror neurons, which this is the neuron that where we feel something just watching someone else do something. For example, if someone happens to stub their toe really hard and we see it and we cringe, that was our neural seeing that happen, and then we feel what it would feel like, and our body reacts even though we weren't that person having that. If we're doing that, then at this deep interpersonal level, there may indeed be some kind of interpersonal grid, if you will, of unconscious information and connection. But it only is able to happen if we just use frequency of the two people are there. I mean, I have no evidence to support that, but it makes me wonder, why is it if in that situation that one time I had, why was it that one person and not all the many other people that I've had wonderful working relationships with and felt and liked a lot and had it that deep. So it may be that the setting, it may be that the connection of the two, and it may just be the timing. I mean, if anyone reads the recent expose on in the journal American Psychologist, which is this huge meta-analysis of the field of psychical research, it's hard to, if you're really scientifically honest and look at the research, it's hard to dismiss that everything is bogus. But then the question is, well, why does it happen sometimes, and why does it not happen? It's kind of you say to a psychic, well, if you're a psychic, you should be right every time. And I would like that to be true, but I'd also like that to be applied to medical doctors and auto mechanics and engineers,
Yeah,
radio talk show hosts.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that actually is a really interesting point, because that kind of brings up the scientific method as a whole, right? That, ironically, science is an ever-changing field, but the scientific method has not changed at all. And especially when it comes to sort of the cognitive sciences, that, sometimes these behaviors, and us being, paranormal investigators working in the field, it doesn't always happen the same way twice. And trying to negotiate that sort of gap between the phenomena and the science of it, and trying to establish patterns when the patterns are ever changing. Now, how would you approach your colleagues in this? I mean, you already have, basically, with these experiences. You know that they happen, but establishing that they are actually happening and being able to repeat it, is that a problem that you're running into?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, certainly. And for the record, I think the scientific method is possibly one of the greatest creations in human history. There's so many wonderful things have come out of the scientific method, and I think it is exceptional. The only thing I'm having issues with is when people who don't really understand what the scientific method is kind of view it more as in, you see this a lot, I believe in science, says someone. Well, it's as one of my colleagues says, that's like saying I believe in a hammer. It's a process that we do, and unfortunately, when things are so fluctuating, it is difficult. So in order to do a study to where we would show that, we'd have to get the same people every time in a controlled setting. And I think Psychical Research has seen that even though, if you read that meta-analysis from the American Psychologist, there has been significant findings. However, it's very difficult, and I don't even know if having those controlled conditions might even eliminate the possibility of those things happening, because then the intimacy, the connection, the interpersonal interaction might be lost doing more laboratory-esque setting.
Then that begs the question, does the personal connection almost negate the evidence?
That's an interesting way to think. A good question there. Well, if you're in the moment of doing your therapy and you're the therapist, the personal experience is all you have. And so if this is happening and both parties know it's happening, it's a good idea to have some kind of working plan, regardless of what's truly happening. Because if your client believes something's happening and it's not something that is clearly, magical thinking to the point to where, it's kind of a pathology there, I think it's something we need to address. It's funny, I read a study out of, I think it was a couple of years ago out of the UK. I think Roxbow was the lead author on it, and it stated that most therapists over there actually requested, when asked on a questionnaire, more training in how to deal with the possibility if strange things happen, or even if the client comes in and says, I have these weird experiences, I don't know what to do with them. We can't dismiss, too, that you turn on any cable network now, you have so many paranormal shows, some that are entertaining and maybe educational, some that are outright, in my opinion, harmful. But it shapes our culture. So maybe someone isn't having a paranormal experience, but due to media, they believe they are. Well, rather than shut them down and dismiss them, why not honor where they're coming from and using our skills to maybe learn to either how to deal with it or to figure out that maybe it might not be paranormal and the person can grow, rather than an automatic jump to that something's wrong with them, they have a pathology, or this is just a bunch of nonsense, or just not talk about it.
Well, we have another question from a listener here, although it's in German. We have listeners in 53 countries with our posting of the recorded shows. However, she does wish us a frohes neues Jahr, Happy New Year. But my German is rusty, and I'm not going to I'll translate this, and we can deal with it at a later date. Okay, so thank you, Rosaline, for sending. Anyway, we'll deal with that. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of non-locality here. Non-locality is generally an understanding and sort of in physics and by extension into consciousness studies as well. And it essentially means, at least as I understand it, that everything you are, your memory, your imagination, even your self, really, is not contained in your body necessarily. It's shared. And this gets into a little bit about Carl Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious. Could you talk a little bit about that, Paul, and how it might apply to everything we've been discussing as far as these experiences and even physical happenings?
Sure. As you were saying, the idea that there's two ways to look at this, and again, we're back to the A and B instead of C, D, E, and F. But the first way is that consciousness, awareness, all of that is created only by the physical aspect of the brain, and the other side is that consciousness is primary, and then the brain is kind of our receiving tool. So our consciousness doesn't end when the brain ceases to function or has problems functioning. Even going back to William James, who had a view of, he felt most everything had a form of consciousness. He called this panpsychism, and he felt that the brain, much like I mentioned before, was a receiving instrument, and there's a filter that allowed a protection from our awareness of so many other things. So to do our day-to-day, get up, cook dinner, go, play with the kids, go to work, all of that, you only need a limited amount of consciousness. When something happens to our brain, whether it's a trauma, whether it is a hallucinogenic drugs, whatever experience, a shock, that filter starts to open up a little bit, and things start to come in from this perspective that James and many other renowned scientists believe. If consciousness is non-local, I'm saying if because I'm not going to say anything definitive here, it would certainly explain why, like I have a story in one of my therapist archives where they're talking about how this one therapist kept getting an image over and over throughout the day, a feeling of dread about a client that they hadn't seen in 6 months. And then later that day or the next day, the client calls and says, I've lost my mother. I'm just, just overwhelmed with grief. How soon can I get in to see you? Well, if the way to explain that, other than it's just coincidence, which to me is kind of in that situation, that's kind of an empty way to answer why that happened. If the mind is non-local and it's connected to this grid of consciousness, maybe due to the intensity, going back to what we talked about, the relationship, when something happens, the therapist picked up on it, much in the way the mother knows something happened to her child, even though the child's in another state, grown person, and they don't talk too often. So I think that is a feasible way to see that when we are interacting in a therapy room in that deep level of connection and rapport, that maybe there is that melding of consciousness, that connection. In quantum they talk about the entanglement. Where
quantum entanglement, exactly.
Right, and maybe that's something consciousness-wise that happens as a result of that deep connection that people have.
Well, actually, let's take a moment here for you to talk about your website, your work, your books, and let people know where they can find out more about you and get the books.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, my website's drpaulleslie.com. It's mostly a site for my therapy and my trainings. I also have a link there for my books. If you just go to all the usual cast of characters, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and just type in Paul, initial J, Leslie, most of my stuff comes up.
Good. Okay. But to return to what we were talking about, if I may make so bold as to perhaps suggest an interpretation to your experience, sure. Your, for lack of a better term, pseudo-mediumistic experience with the client. If you look at, I guess, quantum entanglement, we don't use that term a lot, but it applies. We, as you know, we know each other pretty well. We had to invent a whole new, really, glossary of terms just to talk about some of our weird concepts. Right. One of these is identity point, where consciousness, in our experience at least, being shared, you would have a point where you and another being, might not even be human, would share an identity. And I think this is what I was seeing during possession and exorcism cases back in the 70s. It didn't seem that something had come in and taken over. It seemed that something had established its point of identity with this other personality, and it was not a good situation. So perhaps I might suggest one possibility is that when you were having that experience with the client, you had reached the identity point where you were her father, who was perfectly alive in many, many other versions and parallel realities. I mean, if that theory is correct, that's just one suggestion that we would have. I don't know, Ben, if you want to add to that.
No, I think you nailed it.
All right, well, thank you. At least somebody has one down.
You have my support, Father.
Oh, thank you. So but that's just one thought. I don't know if you had any comment on that or not.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, just from a psychological perspective, maybe her desire to have her father unconsciously, another way to look at it, you're talking about that point, I became the father unconsciously, and information out of her awareness, filled that grid between us, and somehow that came in. So we could look at, I became her father from a quantum level, I became her father from a depth psychotherapy level, or possibly, who knows,
Sure. So I have addressed groups of psychiatrists. I know it's not quite what you do, but it's similar. Actually, what is the difference between a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist for people who might not know?
Well, in today's world, most psychotherapists do psychotherapy, and most psychiatrists do primarily psychopharmacology, so medication.
Precisely, yeah. I think of them as drug dealers.
Some psychiatrists do therapy, but most of them stick to just the meds.
Yeah, that's my understanding. I've addressed groups of psychiatrists twice in the past, some years ago, and I've suggested the notion of non-locality, and that when I worked in mental hospitals, albeit as a theology student and philosophy, not as although I did minor in psychology, but on the undergraduate level, that they were times when I would look into the eyes of a schizophrenic, for example, and there would be such knowing look in return, and it seemed as I just became convinced that at least some of these people were actually in touch with worlds that really existed. Mm-hmm. And there were many times when I thought that the staff at the hospital ought to be the patients and vice versa. Because I don't think I ever worked with one of them that didn't have a messed up personal life and all this kind of, goofy things going on. So, but that was me. Yeah. So, I don't know, I just thought that when I've addressed groups of psychiatrists on this and said, I think these people may be in touch with actual worlds, the steam comes out of the ears and the eyes turn red. And at the end, however, a number of them would come up privately and say, I've suspected the same thing, but if I said that, I'd lose my job. How much politics is involved in all this?
Tons of politics. You probably, if you're a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist or any of that field, you probably don't want to have it get out and about that you are having a lot of strange experiences, or you believe things of a supernatural or even a religious nature, because that's the antithesis of the field, the scientific field. I remember talking with someone who was wasn't a psychiatrist, was like a nurse practitioner, but specialized in mental health, and this person was saying something that they had developed this belief about parasites. I guess that's the term, a parasitic entity.
We've talked about many times.
Yeah, and as an aside, I see that our mutual friend, the great Murray Silver, will be on your show talking about this kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yes. And I think that'll be entertaining.
Couple of weeks, that'll be great.
So, but this person truly believed that. So it's hard to say, but I think it's probably, just to be blunt, it's probably professional suicide to talk too much about those things if you are wanting acceptance of your peers and maybe further development in the field, because then you'll just be that crackpot that they go, well, he or she was really, really cooking for the first decade, but then they went off the deep end, and you get kind of sent to the psychiatrist, psychologist, old folks home, metaphorically.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in working at Ogdensburg State Hospital in New York in the 70s, in the context of working with a priest, there were extreme measures taken to keep things secret, particularly in the case of exorcisms, and there was always a doctor present, 2 attendants, including myself, 2 nurses, and the priest, and the patient, of course. And the rumors still got out. I mean, we were not allowed to associate with one another socially outside of the room. The attendant I was working with, I knew his first name, not his last name, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it would be precisely as you say, professional suicide for the doctor or any of the healthcare professionals to even hint that they've been involved in anything like this. But when stuff started flying off the shelves, obviously that's not the patient's, psychiatric condition or psychosis causing that, directly. So that's when they'd call in Father Lawrence. But anyway, that really rang true so many years ago, and I'm sure it still does in the sense of maintaining one's professional integrity. Excuse me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, I think our field often forgets who the most important person in the therapy room is, and that's the client. And we don't have to agree with our clients' assertions of what is causing, if they're experiencing paranormal phenomena. If they believe that there are ghosts in their home or they're having psychic experiences, we don't have to agree with that. But I think it is of the utmost nature that we respect their model of the world, because I think that's the only way we're going to help people. And if we are instantly so rigid in our view that, telling the client, well, obviously you got a mental health problem, or now that doesn't exist, we not only block the potential that strange things could happen, but we block the potential to help people heal and change. Because if our thoughts and feelings are marginalized by somebody who is considered an expert, but we know we're experiencing these things, I think that's can be very detrimental to the client. I have a case, a real quick one I mentioned in my book, where a young girl who's experiencing paranormal phenomena after going to a therapist for a few sessions about the divorce of her parents discloses that, and then the therapist immediately calls the mother to request that the girl be put on medication. And then surprised when the mother says, "What are you talking about? We're all experiencing that here." And so again, I'm not saying that stuff is really happening, but maybe instead of a knee-jerk response, we meet the client where they are, and then we kind of go from there, because that, to me, in any situation, is probably the best way to handle it.
Very good. Well, we're out of time, and Dr. Paul Leslie, thank you again. We're always in touch off the air, so we'll be talking to you, and thanks again.
Oh, guys, thanks again for having me. It's always a real pleasure.
Okay. So let's go to our announcements, folks. We have on February 15th, we make our appearance at the 5th Annual Book Lovers and Authors Expo on Saturday, 1 to 4, 15th, as I say, at the Cumberland Public Library, 1464 Diamond Hill Road, Cumberland, Rhode Island. On April 4th and 5th, we'll be at the New England Parafest at the Community Center in Kittery, Maine. And we plan to do a live broadcast from there on the 5th, and so stay tuned for more details as that date approaches.
And we'll be back at the Exeter UFO Festival on Labor Day weekend. That's September 5th and 6th as speakers, and to do our 5th annual live broadcast from the historic Exeter Town Hall on Sunday the 6th at noon. The event is sponsored by the Exeter Area Kiwanis Club to raise funds for local children's charities.
Okay, and then lots of other events coming up as well.
So you can also check out our books, including Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong, and Behind the Paranormal 2, Bigfoot, Mothman, and Monsters You've Never Heard of. And now, Dancing Past the Graveyard, Poltergeist, Parasites, Parallel Worlds, and God, and they're available from online retailers and in some stores. But for autographed copies, please visit our online bookstore at behindtheparanormal.com.
Okay. We are out of faces at the window, though, by the way, but that'll be remedied. Check out our charity page on the website as well, and that'll include lots of charities that are really good that we've checked out ourselves. Again, behindtheparanormal.com. What do we have for next week, Ben?
So next week, that is the Sunday, the January 19th, we will bring you another one of our famous Open Line shows with special guest co-host Shane Searway.
And you had a word about Apple iTunes.
Yes. So if you are listening to us on Apple iTunes, please subscribe to our podcast, give us a rating as well, and leave a review. It helps us grow our podcast, and it also helps get into sort of the circulation of other podcasts on Apple iTunes.
Okay. So I guess we don't have time for our quote, but I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.